The biker's hand closed around her collar, and he pulled. The sound of tearing fabric cut through every conversation in that bar. Dead silence. 7 iron grave bikers, 1 waitress, a diner in the middle of nowhere, Montana. What they saw on her shoulder stopped every man in that room cold. A tattoo, military grade, the kind you don't get at a parlor, the kind you earn. Kyle Denton, 6'3", 230 pounds of scar tissue and bad decisions, looked at that tattoo and went completely still. SWCC, he said, flat, like a man who'd just stepped on a landmine and hadn't moved yet. She turned around slowly. No fear, no shaking, just those gray eyes, level and quiet, looking straight at him. I've been tracking your route for 18 months, she said. You arrived exactly on schedule. The whole bar forgot to breathe. Because this wasn't a waitress. This was the woman who'd spent 3 years hunting the men responsible for killing someone she loved. And she'd been pouring their coffee all morning. What happens next? Nobody in that room was ready for it, and neither are you. Some mornings in Cutter's Creek move like cold honey, slow, thick, like the world forgot to hurry. Grant Elwood had been coming to the Rusty Nail every morning for 20 years. Same corner table, same black coffee, same view of Main Street through a window that hadn't been cleaned since the Bush administration. He liked it that way. At 67, Grant had earned the right to like things exactly as they were. The town had maybe 1,200 people, give or take. Mostly ranchers, a few retired miners, some folks who just ended up here and never left. The kind of place where you knew whose truck was whose before you saw the license plate. Where news traveled faster than cell service. Where a stranger's face stayed a stranger's face for about 48 hours before somebody decided what to make of it. The Rusty Nail opened at 6 in the morning. Patty Oswalt ran it the way her mother had run it before her. No nonsense. Good coffee. Food that stuck to your ribs and kept you going through the kind of mornings that Montana handed out without apology. The counter was pine. The stools were vinyl. The mounted elk above the door had been there so long it had become invisible, the way permanent things do. And for the past 6 months, there had been Nora Callahan, 25 years old. Blonde hair pulled back tight every single morning. Gray eyes that caught things without appearing to look for them. Thin in the way that suggested she had earned it. Not starved for it. Earned it. She showed up one Tuesday in June, asking Patty about the help wanted sign taped to the inside of the window. Patty hired her the same afternoon. She told Grant later it was because the girl had looked her straight in the eye the whole time she was talking. Most people look away, Patty said, especially when they want something. They look at the floor or the wall or anywhere that isn't your face. She didn't look away once. Grant had watched Nora work every morning since then, not in a strange way. More the way you watch a good border collie work a field. There was something efficient about her, something purposeful, like every movement had been decided before she made it. She carried 4 plates at once without thinking about it. She remembered every regular's order after one visit. She never wrote anything down. She could hold 7 different drink orders in her head while simultaneously clearing a table and answering a question from the kitchen. Small things. But Grant noticed small things. That was what 20 years underground did to a man. In the mines, you learned to read the ceiling. A hairline crack that nobody else saw. A thin gray line in the stone that shouldn't be there. Could be the difference between going home and not going home. You learned to notice. You learned that what seemed small was often the most important thing in the room. Grant read people the same way now, and Nora Callahan had hairline cracks everywhere. The way she always chose to sit with her back to the wall on her breaks. The way she registered the door every single time it opened. Not nervous, not jumpy, just aware. The way she tracked movement in her peripheral vision without turning her head. Like someone who had trained the habit so deep it had become automatic. In October, a car had backfired on Main Street. Loud, sharp. The sound cracked through the window glass like a flat hand on a table. Every other person in the diner flinched. Ed Purcell spilled half his coffee. One of the Delaney brothers knocked over a salt shaker. Nora didn't flinch. She had looked toward the window, assessed, went back to pouring coffee in one smooth, uninterrupted motion. Grant had filed that away and said nothing. He was good at saying nothing. It was one of the most useful skills he had ever developed. You learned it in the mines. You learned it raising 2 sons alone after their mother left. You learned it in the years after retirement when the silence of the house asked you questions you weren't ready to answer. You learned that some things revealed themselves if you gave them enough quiet. He gave Nora quiet. He watched. He waited. He was still waiting. The morning of December 12th started the same as every other morning. Grant came in at 6:15. Nora had his coffee ready before he reached the table. She set it down with a small nod, the same nod she gave him every morning, and went back to wiping the counter. Outside, frost clung to every surface along Main Street. The pickup trucks parked at the curb were white with it. The mountains to the west had their winter cover now, the peaks buried under snow that wouldn't leave until April if they were lucky. The sky was the particular gray of a Montana December morning, flat and low and heavy with everything it was holding back. Grant wrapped both hands around the mug. A rancher named Ed Purcell came in at 6:30. Then Martha Greer, who ran the post office and had for 30 years. Then 2 men from the highway maintenance crew, who always sat at the same table and never spoke to each other and somehow seemed to prefer it that way. Ordinary Tuesday morning. Patty came out from the kitchen around 7, untying her apron strings and retying them out of habit. "You eating today, Grant, or just occupying space, thinking about the eggs? You think about the eggs every morning. Sometimes I order them. Last time you ordered the eggs was March. I think about them more than I order them." She shook her head and went back to the kitchen. This was their routine, and they both understood it was the routine, and neither of them wanted to change it. Nora refilled his coffee without being asked. She had this quality of anticipating things by about 30 seconds. You would think about reaching for your mug, and she would already be there. Grant watched her move back to the counter. "You ever going to tell me where you're from?" he asked. She looked over her shoulder. "Wisconsin. What part?" "The cold part." He smiled into his mug. "That narrows it down to about all of it." She almost smiled back. Almost. The corner of her mouth moved, and then she decided against it. It was the most personal exchange they had managed in 6 months. Grant went back to his coffee and let it rest there. Some things needed to arrive at their own pace. Pressing them only taught them to go sideways. He had time. He always had time now. He heard them before he saw them. Most people who spend long enough in quiet places develop an ear for things that don't belong. Not a dramatic gift. Just the natural result of learning what a place sounds like when it's being itself. Cutter's Creek on a Tuesday morning in December sounded like wind and the distant groan of a cattle gate, and the hum of Martha's old Subaru idling outside the post office, and the particular creak of the Rusty Nails pine floor when someone moved from the counter to the tables. The sound of multiple motorcycles approaching was something else entirely. Not 1 or 2, which might be someone passing through or a local heading to the Valley Road. This was 7 or 8 engines running together. The kind of number that carries intention whether it means to or not. Grant set down his mug. Nora stopped wiping the counter. That was the first thing he noticed. She stopped completely. Her cloth stopped moving. Her head turned slightly, not toward the window but away from it, the way someone turns when they are using ears instead of their eyes, like an antenna rotating toward a signal. The motorcycles came down Main Street slow and deliberate. There was no hurry in it. The engines were big, and they didn't bother being quiet about it. The sound filled the block and bounced off the storefronts and settled into the cold air like it intended to stay. They pulled up in front of the Rusty Nail. 7 bikes, black and chrome. They cut their engines one by one, and the silence that followed was the kind that felt louder than the noise had been. Iron Grave MC. Grant had heard the name. Everybody in this part of Montana had heard it the way you hear about weather patterns. You didn't need to have experienced it personally to know what it meant when it was coming your way. A club that moved through the northern corridor, into Canada and back, using the back roads that didn't have much traffic and even less oversight. Not the kind of club that organized fundraisers or ran toy drives at Christmas. The other kind. Through the window, Grant watched them dismount. 7 men, black leather jackets with the iron grave patch on the back, a crowned skull. The design had a quality of wanting to be noticed, which was itself a kind of information. They moved with the unhurried confidence of people who had learned over time that other people tend to arrange themselves accordingly. The man who led them was the largest, 6'3" at least. Heavy through the chest and shoulders in a way that looked structural rather than decorative. A beard that had been growing for years, dark going gray at the edges. Eyes the color of ice on a January creek. That particular pale blue that doesn't warm up regardless of the season. A scar ran from his left ear down to the edge of his chin. Old scar, clean line. Something sharp and precise had made that mark a long time ago, and he had decided not to cover it up, which was its own kind of statement. He came through the door of the Rusty Nail first. He stood just inside the entrance and did not look at the room. the way most people look at a room when they walk in. He looked at it the way you look at a room when you are not looking at the room, when you are looking for one specific thing and everything else is background noise. His eyes moved across the tables, across Grant, across Ed Purcell bent over his plate, across the highway crew who had both gone very still. And then they came to Nora behind the counter and stopped. Something passed across his face, fast, a shadow moving over water, there and gone in less than a second. An expression that Grant could not fully name but felt he recognized in the way you recognize the sound of a familiar voice speaking a word in an unfamiliar language. Then Kyle Denton walked to a table and sat down. The others filed in behind him. The room had changed. Grant would have had trouble explaining it to someone who wasn't in it. The chairs were the same, the walls were the same, the smell of coffee and the low sound of the heater in the corner were the same. Nothing physical had been altered, but the room had changed. The air pressure had changed. Ed Purcell had gone very focused on his food. Martha Greer sat without moving, her coffee cup exactly halfway between the table and her mouth suspended. The highway crew were studying their plates with the attention of men reading important documents. Nobody was looking at the iron grave table, which meant everybody was aware of it. Grant kept his eyes where they had been, moved them when it was natural to move them, did not let them linger anywhere too long. And you, the mind, not his narrative in the sea is crack. Staring told your body to panic. You looked at it, registered it, and moved your eyes somewhere else while your brain kept tracking it. He tracked. Nora walked to their table. She pulled out her order pad, pen ready. Her face was the same face it had been all morning. The same measured neutrality she carried like a second uniform. "Morning," she said. "What can I get you?" The man beside Kyle, shorter but thick, across the chest and shoulders, with hands that had been broken and healed more than once, looked up at her with a specific kind of laziness. The laziness of a man who has not been told no enough times in his life to learn what it sounds like. His name was Decker. Grant would learn that later. Honey," Decker said, "why don't you start by smiling?" Nora looked at him for exactly the amount of time required. "I can start with coffee," she said. "Smiles extra." Two of the men at the table laughed. The sound was genuine, surprised. Even the corner of Kyle's mouth moved fractionally. Decker did not laugh. He looked at Nora with his head tilted slightly, recalculating. Nora took their orders, 7 different orders, not one of them easy. She held all of it in her head without a single question and walked back to the counter to put it in with Patty. Grant watched Kyle watch her walk away. That was the thing that stayed with him. The others watched her the way men sometimes watch women in bars and diners, and it was unpleasant, but it was legible. You knew what it was. Kyle watched her differently. He watched her the way you watch something that doesn't quite add up, the way a good mechanic watches an engine running slightly wrong, not sure yet where the problem is, but certain that it's there. That kind of watching was more careful, more patient. Grant had a bad feeling about patient men. The morning stretched long and slow and uncomfortable the way mornings do when something wrong has been introduced to a space, and everyone is pretending they don't feel it. The iron grave men ate. They drank coffee, and then they drank from a flask that appeared at the table around 10 and made its way around without anyone offering it elsewhere. The volume of their conversation went up. The radius of their presence in the room expanded. This was a specific process that Grant had witnessed in bars and in certain sections of the mine, and it always went the same direction. Ed Purcell paid his bill quietly and left without finishing his food. Martha did the same 15 minutes later. The highway crew stayed. They were caught in the calculation that most people get caught in. Whether leaving drew more attention than staying. They stayed and ate nothing and stared at their plates, and Grant understood their position. Nora kept working. She refilled their cups when they were empty. She brought food when they ordered more. She said please and thank you with the precision of someone who has decided exactly how much she is going to give a room, and not one atom more. Kyle Denton had not touched the flask. He sat with one arm along the back of the empty chair beside him, and he watched the room, and he watched Nora, and the watching was consistent and patient, and Grant found it more unsettling than anything else happening at that table. Patient men are the dangerous ones. His father had said that down in the Anaconda shafts in 1987. They had been talking about something else entirely, a supervisor who never raised his voice. But the lesson applied everywhere Grant had ever tried to use it. The ceiling doesn't come down in a hurry, it waits. It lets you get comfortable, it lets you stop listening. Then it comes down. Patient things are the most dangerous thing. Decker had found his moment around 10:30. Nora was setting a plate down in front of him. He reached out and put his hand over hers on the plate. Not grabbing, just covering, like he was doing her a favor. "You know," he said, "you've got a real nice way of moving around this place, like you've been doing it your whole life. Were you born graceful, or did somebody teach you?" Nora looked at his hand on hers. She did not pull away. She looked at the hand. Then she looked at him. "I'm going to need that hand back," she said, "to carry the rest of your food." Decker grinned, the grin of a man who has mistaken persistence for charm so many times he can no longer tell them apart. "What if I want to hold on to it? Then the rest of your food goes back to the kitchen and gets cold, and we all have a worse morning than we need to." He held on for 3 more seconds, establishing something, letting her know that he was making the choice. Then he let go. Nora picked up her tray and walked away without looking back. Grant released a breath he had not fully noticed he was holding. Kyle watched the whole exchange and said nothing. At 11:15, Patty appeared at Grant's table with the coffee pot and bent down to refill his cup and said in a voice barely above a murmur, "I called my sister in Billings. She's got the phone on speaker near the front room window. Can hear the road outside. I told her if I call back and say the word Birch, she should call the county sheriff's office." Grant nodded very slightly. "That's smart," he said at the same volume. "It's terrified," Patty said, "but smart too, I suppose." She went back to the kitchen. Nora brought Grant's bill around 11:30, though he hadn't asked for it. She set it face down on the table the way she always did. She didn't look at him directly when she set it down. He turned it over when she was walking away. On the back, in small handwriting that was precise and spare, 4 words: "Stay. Don't call anyone." Grant read it twice, folded the paper, put it in his shirt pocket. He ordered the eggs. The lunch crowd did not come. Word had moved through Cutter's Creek the way word moves in small towns, not through phone calls or texts, through the particular silence of a place where someone has driven past a window and seen what's inside and kept driving. By 12:30, the only people in the Rusty Nail were Grant, the 7 iron grave men, Nora, and Patty working quietly in the kitchen. The flask was emptier now. The conversation at the iron grave table had the loose, circular quality of men getting comfortable in a space they have decided belongs to them. Kyle Denton still had not touched. He had eaten. He had sat. He had continued to watch Nora with the same patient, calibrating attention. And Grant had continued to watch him watch her. And the thing that bothered Grant most was not the watching itself, but the quality of it. There was no entertainment in it, no casual interest. Kyle was not watching Nora the way the others watched her. He was working something out. What he was working out, Grant didn't know. But he had learned a long time ago that when a large, patient, sober man in a dangerous situation is working something out, the right move is to stay in your seat and keep your face still and wait to find out what he decides. Decker stood up around noon. He had been building toward it for an hour. You could see it in the way he had been sitting, the way a man sits when he is accumulating courage or permission from himself. He walked to the counter where Nora was restocking the coffee machine, and he stood too close. And he said her name, which he had gotten from the little nameplate on her apron, and he said it like he owned it. "Nora." She didn't turn. "I hear you," she said. "Look at me." She finished what she was doing with the coffee machine. Set the pot down, turned. "What would you like?" I said. "I'd like," he said, leaning on the counter with both forearms, "for you to stop pretending you don't know I'm here." "I know you're here," she said. "I've refilled your cup 4 times. That's not what I mean." "I know what you mean. I'm choosing to respond to the version I prefer." Something moved across Decker's face, and not anger exactly, more like a man encountering a door that should open and isn't opening. "You're a lot of mouth for a waitress," he said. "Yes," she said. "I am." He reached out, he grabbed the back of her collar, and he pulled. The sound was wrong. That was Grant's first thought, and he would not fully understand why until later. Not the sound of a seam giving, not a snap or a pop, those fast, small sounds of fabric under stress. This was a slow tear. Deliberate in the way that slow things feel deliberate even when they aren't. The sound stretched across the room and filled every corner of it and then stopped. Time did something. It didn't stop, but it changed its character, became more precise, more granular. The way your senses sharpen at altitude or at the edge of something irreversible. The collar of Nora's shirt came away in Decker's hand. She did not move, did not stumble forward or spin around or make a sound. She stood exactly as she had been standing. And the room saw what Decker had uncovered: her left shoulder, the upper portion of her back just below the base of her neck, a section of skin that the shirt had been covering, a tattoo, not a decorative tattoo. Not a rose or a name or something chosen from a parlor wall on a Friday night. This was a different kind of mark, institutional. Earned, the kind of tattoo that means something specific to specific people and nothing decorative to anyone. A trident, the Naval Special Warfare Trident. An eagle with its wings spread, clutching in its talons an anchor and a Navy trident and a flintlock pistol. The mark of the Naval Special Warfare community. The mark that SEALs wore. The mark that the men who worked alongside them, who drove the boats in the dark water of places that didn't appear on the evening news, wore as well. Below the trident, in small clean letters, a number and a designation. SWCC. Special Warfare Combatant Craft Crewman. Grant knew what SWCC was. He knew because his nephew Marcus had tried to get into the program 6 years ago. Had gone to Coronado for the selection and washed out in the first week. Had come home 25 pounds lighter and didn't talk about what had happened for almost a year. Had told Grant once, late at night after enough whiskey, that it was the hardest thing he had ever attempted, and that he did not regret trying, and that the people who made it were a different category of person. A different category. Grant looked at the tattoo on Nora Callahan's shoulder. Then he looked at Nora Callahan. She had not moved. She was standing exactly where she had been, in shoulders level. Her hands were at her sides. She had not reached up to cover herself. She had not turned around to face the room. She was waiting for the room to process what it was seeing, giving it the seconds it needed. Like a teacher who has put something on the board and is standing back while the students catch up. The bar was absolutely silent. Not the silence of an empty place. It's the silence of a full place where every person is simultaneously stopped. Decker stood behind her with the torn collar still in his hand. The grin had left his face as completely and suddenly as if a switch had been thrown. He was looking at the tattoo with the expression of a man who has kicked something he was confident was a stone and discovered the moment his foot connected that it was something else. Something that didn't move like a stone. Something that had not appreciated being kicked. One of the other men at the table said something very low that Grant didn't catch. The others at the table had gone still. Grant looked at Kyle Denton. Kyle had not stood up. He had not moved from his chair. But his face was the thing Grant would return to in the days afterward. When he was trying to put the shape of the day together. When he lay in bed at night and ran through it looking for the place where it had turned. Kyle Denton was looking at the tattoo on Nora's shoulder, with an expression that Grant had no clean word for. It was not fear. It was not surprise exactly. It was the expression of a man who has heard his own name spoken clearly in a room where his name should not have been known. A kind of unwilling recognition, like seeing something you had hoped was gone and understanding in one breath that it was not gone at all. That it had simply been somewhere else while you were here, and now here was wherever you were. Kyle's hands flat on the tabletop pressed slowly. His jaw set. He said one word. Low. Almost to himself. Where? Not a question. Not exactly. The beginning of something he had not yet decided whether to finish. Nora turned around. She did it slowly. Without any hurry, she reached to the side of the counter and picked up her order pad and set it down again. A grounding gesture. Something small and habitual to mark the transition. She looked at Decker. The torn piece of fabric hung from his hand. He was still holding it. Still hadn't thought to put it down. Still caught in the moment between the action and understanding what the action had revealed. Put that down, she said. He put it down. She looked at the men at the table, one by one. She did not do it dramatically. She did it the way you do an inventory, methodical. And then she looked at Kyle. For the first time since he had walked through the door, Kyle Denton was on the receiving end of something he had not chosen to receive. Her eyes were gray in the low light of the diner. They were completely steady. Kyle looked back at her and Grant watched something move through him, not visible in any single feature, more like a weather system passing through, visible only in the overall change of atmosphere. Everyone is going to settle down now, Nora said. Her voice was the same voice she had used all morning, the same pitch, the same pace, the voice she used taking orders and offering refills and saying thank you to people who didn't always deserve it, except now Grant could hear what was underneath it. What had always been underneath it, and what the morning had not yet called forward until this moment. A voice trained to stay level when everything around it was not. The voice of someone who had used it in the dark, on water, in situations where the distance between calm and panic was the distance between outcome and consequence. Patty appeared in the kitchen doorway. Nora did not look at her. She kept her eyes on the room. Patty, she said, go to the back. Patty went, without a word, without a question. Grant stayed where he was, Nora looked at him. 1 second, the briefest exchange of information. He gave the smallest nod he could manage. She turned back to the room. Kyle Denton stood up. He was the only one who did. The others stayed seated. Not because anyone told them to. Because the man who had established the room's order since walking through the door was now standing and looking at a woman who had just quietly reordered everything in it without raising her voice. And they were waiting to understand what that meant. Kyle walked toward the counter. He moved without hurry. He stopped about 4 feet away. He looked at the tattoo, then he looked at her face. SWCC, he said. It was flat. Not a question. The naming of something confirmed. Yes. How long? 4 years active. He absorbed that, nodded once, slowly like a man reviewing a document. When did you select? 2019. Something shifted in his face. Another internal calculation becoming a conclusion. That puts you in the Pacific rotation, he said. 2021 and 2022. Nora said nothing. Kyle looked at her for a long time. Long enough that Decker shifted in his seat behind him, but nobody else moved. You knew someone, Kyle said. Someone running operations in the Gulf of Aden corridor, 2022. Nora held his gaze. She said nothing. Kyle took a breath through his nose, slow, deliberate. I've been in Montana for 6 weeks, he said. Nevada before that. Before Nevada, I can't tell you specifically. Somebody has been tracking our route, staying about 1 step behind us. Watching. He paused. I've been aware of it for about 4 months. He looked at her with those pale blue eyes. That you? Grant set down his coffee cup without meaning to. The small of ceramic on pine was the only sound in the room. This was the moment. Not the torn shirt, not the tattoo and the silence in the frozen room. This was the actual moment, the one that contained all the others and gave them their meaning. Nora Callahan, 25 years old, standing behind the counter of a diner in a small Montana town with her shirt torn and no backup and no visible weapon, and 7 men in the room and the man who led those 7 men looking at her from 4 feet away and asking the question that the last 18 months had been building toward. She looked at him steadily. I've been tracking your route for 18 months, she said. Her voice did not shake. You arrived in Cutter's Creek exactly on schedule. Nobody moved. Grant became aware of the clock above the counter. He could hear it ticking. He had never noticed it before. Kyle Denton looked at Nora the way you look at something that has revealed a dimension you weren't accounting for. Not larger than expected, just differently shaped, in a way that required revision. You're alone, he said. Right now. That's not a particularly safe position. No, so what is it you want? The question landed in the room and stayed there. What do you want? The most direct question. The one that cuts through everything else and demands the same directness back. Nora held the silence for 2 full seconds. Then she said it. I want to know what happened on the water, off the Somali coast. October 2022. She said the way you say something you have rehearsed 1,000 times and have decided you are only going to say once, out loud, to the right person. And this is the moment, and the person, and you are going to say it clearly. The room absorbed it. Kyle's face went through something that had nothing performed about it. Something private happening in a public place that he could not entirely prevent. The face of a man arriving at a crossroads he had been taking alternate routes around for 3 years. That, he said after a long moment, is not a conversation for a diner. No, Nora said, it isn't. Kyle looked around the room, a slow, complete survey. Grant, Decker, his men, the empty tables, the elk on the wall, the window and the gray December sky outside. He looked back at Nora. You're not a waitress, he said. I'm a very good waitress, she said. I've also been other things. Something moved across Kyle Denton's face that Grant would not have predicted. Something that looked, at least for the moment it lasted, like a form of recognition that was almost respect. Not warm, nothing warm about Kyle Denton. But something in the range of one professional acknowledging another. Tonight, Kyle said, after you close. If you want the conversation, I'll have it. I want it. He nodded. One tight movement. He turned back to his table, said something quiet. The men around him began the process of leaving. Jackets pulled on. The flask disappeared. Chairs scraped back from the table, filed out the door of in the same order they had come in, most of them without looking at anyone. Kyle Denton went last. At the door, he paused. He did not turn around. Whatever you think you know about what happened, he said, I promise you don't know all of it. Then he pushed through the door and walked out. The engine started, and one by one, and then in a group. The sound built and moved and pulled down the street and faded until Cutter's Creek sounded like itself again. The clock above the counter ticked. Grant sat in the silence for a full minute, and then another. He was aware of his own breathing, the weight of his hands on the table, the cooling mug between them. He looked at Nora. She had her back to him. She was holding the edge of the counter with both hands, not leaning on it, gripping it. Her knuckles were white. Her shoulders were doing something they had not done once all morning. They had fallen, not collapsed, just lowered, a fraction of an inch. The kind of movement that happens when something that has been held perfectly in position for hours is allowed for just a single moment to simply exist. Grant got up slowly, walked to the counter. He did not have polished words for moments like this. He was 67 years old and from a part of the country and a profession where you learned that most important things didn't need polished words. That showing up was usually the better thing. He just stood there. After a while, maybe 30 seconds, maybe more, Nora let go of the counter. She turned. "I'm sorry about the mess," she said. Her voice was even, completely controlled. "Patty'll manage." A pause, short, like a breath being taken somewhere more careful than the lungs. "Are you going to ask me?" she said. "Which part do you want me to ask about?" That almost got her again. The corner of her mouth moved. "My name is Nora Callahan," she said. "I was SWCC for 4 years. I left the Navy in November 2022 because someone I served with didn't come home from a mission and the official report didn't match anything I knew to be true. I have spent the 3 years since then trying to find out what actually happened." Grant was quiet for a moment. "How long have you been carrying that alone?" 3 years, that's a long time. "Yes, did you have another option?" She thought about that, actually thought about it rather than answering immediately. "I thought I didn't," she said. "I'm not sure anymore." Grant looked at her. "What changed?" "I'm still figuring that out." He nodded. He went back to his corner table. He sat down. He did not leave. The afternoon came in around the edges of the windows, pale and thin the way December light arrives in Montana, like it's apologizing for showing up at all. Patty came out of the kitchen eventually. She looked at the piece of torn collar on the floor. She picked it up without a word. She put it in the trash behind the counter. She went back to the kitchen. This was one of the things Grant had always valued in Patty Oswalt, her understanding that some things required words, and some things required action, and some moments required neither. Just the small physical act of acknowledgement, the picking up of the thing that had fallen, the quiet disposal of it, the returning to what needed to continue. A few townspeople drifted in through the afternoon, word of the morning having made its particular journey through Cutter's Creek. They stayed for coffee. They asked Grant quiet questions, and he answered them with what he thought they needed, rather than everything he knew, which was usually the wiser proportion. The sheriff's cruiser came down Main Street around 3 o'clock, drove past slowly, did not stop. Grant watched it pass with a feeling he had been cultivating for a couple of years now, a slow, careful unease about Bart Leland that he had never been able to entirely articulate. Small thing, the way certain complaints from the eastern part of the county had a habit of not progressing. The way Iron Grave had moved through this corner of Montana on at least 2 previous occasions without receiving so much as a traffic citation. He had kept it somewhere quiet in the back of his mind. The way you kept things that didn't have a place yet. He had a lot of things filed away and hadn't known what to do with them, and had told himself that maybe they didn't add up to what he suspected, and that at his age he was entitled to leave certain problems to people younger and more certain than himself. He was not as confident about that as he had been this morning. At 4 in the afternoon, Nora took cups of coffee to his table and sat down across from him. It was the first time she had sat on his side of the counter. She wrapped both hands around her cup and looked out the window for a moment before she said anything. "You were in the military," she said. "No, but I had a brother who served, Korea era, and I spent 20 years in underground mining where the things that go wrong very fast. It's not the same as what you've done, but some of what it teaches you is similar." She nodded, accepting the distinction and its limits. "The man I've been trying to find out about," she said. "His name is James Corvin. He was a SEAL operator. We were assigned together on a joint operation in the Gulf of Aden in October 2022. Something went wrong during the insertion. He didn't come back from it." She stopped, looked at her coffee. "The official record says he was killed in action." "You don't believe that?" "The official record has 3 factual errors in the first 2 paragraphs. Basic operational details that any operator or support or crew member would have gotten right. Someone wrote that document who was not present for the events it describes." Grant was quiet. An iron grave was involved. An iron grave patch was visible on the jacket of the shooter who fired on our boat that night. She paused. I don't know the full extent of Kyle Denton's role. I don't know if he ordered it or participated in it directly, or was simply connected to someone who was. That is what I have been trying to establish. Hence tonight. Hence 18 months of tracking and 6 months of waiting in this diner, and tonight, yes. Grant studied his coffee cup, the grain of the pine table, the window and the fading fiend afternoon outside it. The man you lost, he said. Corvin, he was important to you. She looked at the window for a moment. He was the most honestly decent person I served with, she said. In 4 years, and I served with a lot of people. He cared about what the job was supposed to be for, not just the execution of it. He was the kind of person who makes you understand why it matters, why the whole thing matters. She stopped. I know that sounds simple. The true things usually do. She looked at him directly. Something shifted almost imperceptibly in her expression. A small adjustment, like a door opening a quarter inch. He has a sister, she said. Her name is Lila. She lives about 40 miles from here, in Whitefish. She's a nurse. She believes James died in a training accident. That is what the Navy told the family. A training accident. She stopped again, longer this time. She has never been told what actually happened. She has never been told where he actually was, when he died, or what he was doing. Grant sat with that. And you haven't told her. I have been trying to learn the truth before I take away the version she has made peace with. Before I replace something she has learned to carry with something heavier. Her voice was careful in the way voices are when they are being held to a specific job. She lost her brother. I didn't want to go to her with questions and suspicions and no answers. I wanted to go to her with the truth. That's a generous way to think about it. It's the only way I could think about it. Grant looked out the window. A raven was sitting on the telephone wire across the street, perfectly motionless in the cold. Nora, he said carefully, I want to say something and I hope you'll take it in the spirit it's intended. She looked at him. You have carried this alone for 3 years because you decided you needed to have the answers before you brought it to anyone else, before you brought it to her. He paused. That is a generous impulse, but it has also meant that you have carried something that was always bigger than one person's and was built to carry. And it has meant that Lila Corvin has been living for 3 years without knowing that someone who loved her brother is out here, working for the truth of what happened to him. He stopped. That might matter to her. Even before you have all the answers. Nora looked at him. She did not answer immediately. The raven on the wire lifted off without warning and disappeared into the gray sky. I've thought about that, she said finally. I imagine you have. I didn't know how to begin that conversation. Nobody ever does, Grant said. They have it anyway. Grant finished his coffee. He thought about something else, something small that he had not mentioned. 3 days ago, a woman had stopped at the gas station at the edge of town. Dark red hair, scrubs under her coat. She had asked the attendant if there was a diner nearby, somewhere she could get coffee on the drive back from a long shift. The attendant had pointed at the rusty nail. The woman had looked at it for a long moment. Then she had gotten back in her car and driven away. Grant had seen it from the window. He had filed it away the way he filed everything, not knowing yet which drawer it belonged in. Silence settled, not uncomfortable. The kind of silence between two people who have understood something together and don't need to put it into more words than it requires. Grant finished his coffee. You should know, he said after a while, that the sheriff's cruiser driving past without stopping this afternoon was not Bart Leland doing an odd job. Nora looked at him. It was Bart Leland checking on something. She nodded slowly. I know. You knew before I said it. I noticed the first time he drove past. Before noon, the angle of the vehicle. He slowed down but didn't stop. If he were responding to a call, he would have stopped. She paused. He knows Kyle Denton, not the way a sheriff knows a criminal he's training. The other way. Grant let out a slow breath. So the county sheriff is not a resource available to us tonight? No. That limits things. Yes. Grant nodded. He turned his coffee cup in a slow circle on the table. What do you need from me? He said. Nora looked at him with a directness that had no performance in it. I need you to stay, she said, and I need you to use your judgment about the rest. Grant looked back at her. 67 years old, 20 years underground, 2 sons raised, a body that ached in places he hadn't known were places when he was 40, a corner table and cold coffee and a Montana winter pressing against the windows. All right, he said. He stayed. Nora turned the sign to closed at 5:45. She moved through the diner with a quiet precision, clearing the last of the afternoon cups, wiping down tables, straightening chairs. The routine of closing carried out as if the day had been ordinary. as if doing the ordinary things was part of the preparation for what was not ordinary. Patty came out from the kitchen at 6, coat on, keys in hand. She stood for a moment looking at the room, at Nora, at Grant in his corner. "You don't have to be here for this," Nora said. "I know that," Patty said. She looked at the diner for a moment longer. Her mother's diner, her life's work, the pine counter and the vinyl stools and the elk on the wall and the window that hadn't been cleaned in too long. "Nora," she said. Nora looked up. "Whatever comes through that door tonight," Patty said, "this place has seen harder things than it looks like it has. The walls can take it." She pulled her coat closed. "Try not to break the coffee machine. Everything else is negotiable." She walked out. The door closed. Her footsteps crossed the porch and extended to the street and faded. The diner was quiet. Grant poured himself the last of the coffee from the pot behind the counter, which Nora did not object to, and settled back into his corner with it. He looked at the room, the low light, the empty chairs and tables, the window showing the dark street outside. He thought about his brother, who had come home from Korea changed in ways he never fully explained, who had rebuilt himself over years into someone Grant recognized again, who had told him once that the hardest part was not what happened overseas, but the returning to ordinary life while carrying it. The sitting in a diner and drinking coffee and pretending the world was only as large as the room. He thought about Marcus, who had washed out of SWCC selection and come home thinner and quieter, and who had eventually found a life that fit him, but who still sometimes looked at things with a particular distance of someone who knows what they couldn't do. He thought about Nora Callahan, 25 years old, sitting in a chair she had pulled from the nearest table to face the door, hands folded in her lap, completely still. The things we carry, he thought. The things we decide are ours to carry and then carry alone for so long that we forget we made the decision, that it was a decision. That decisions can be revisited. She was 25. She had been carrying this since she was 22. The clock above the counter ticked. 6:12. The heater hummed in its corner. Outside, somewhere down Main Street, a door closed. A dog barked twice and stopped. Nora Callahan sat and faced the door and waited. Grant Elwood sat in his corner with his cold coffee and his 67 years, and what he hoped was a reasonable approximation of wisdom, and he waited alongside her. The dark outside the window was complete now, the mountains invisible, the sky and the ground all one darkness, the way it gets in Montana in December when there is no moon and the clouds have covered the stars. In that kind of dark, Grant knew, things that were coming toward you were invisible until they were already very close. You felt them before you saw them. He was feeling something now. He stayed where he was. He had decided. He came back alone. That was the first thing Grant noticed. 7 motorcycles had pulled up to the Rusty Nail that morning. 7 men had walked through the door. And when Kyle Denton stepped out of the dark at 6:43 in the evening, he stepped out of it alone. No engines, no advance noise. He had walked. Grant heard the boots on the porch first, one set measured. The particular weight distribution of a large man who has learned to move quietly, which is a different thing from a man who is naturally quiet. One is a trait. The other is a decision made so many times it has become a trait. Nora heard it too. She did not stand up. She did not change her posture or the position of her hands. But Grant watched her eyes move to the door, and they did not move with the wariness of someone who has been surprised. They moved with the attention of someone whose timing has been confirmed. Kyle Denton pushed through the door without knocking. He stood just inside, looked at Nora in her chair, looked at Grant in the corner. He did not look surprised to see Grant there. He gave Grant the brief, assessing look of a man deciding whether a variable is relevant. And then he apparently decided Grant was not immediately relevant because he moved his eyes back to Nora. "You got coffee?" he said. "Yes," Nora said. "I'll take some." She stood and went behind the counter. Kyle walked to the table nearest the center of the room. He pulled out a chair and turned it around and sat on it backwards, arms crossed over the top of the back. It was a specific way of sitting. It put the chair between himself and the room. An old habit. The habit of someone who has spent time in places where having something between yourself and the room was a reasonable precaution. Nora set a cup down in front of him. She pulled her own chair closer to the table and sat. Grant stayed in his corner. Kyle wrapped both hands around the cup. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at Nora. "You're going to want to know how I know the tattoo," he said. "Yes. And you're going to want to know what I know about October 2022. Well, yes. And you're going to have a version of events in your head, something you've built over 3 years. Evidence and inference and the conclusions you arrived at. Yes. Kyle nodded once. He drank some coffee. Most of what you've concluded is probably right, he said. And at least one thing is wrong. The thing that matters most. Nora said nothing. She looked at him and waited. Kyle set the cup down. I'm going to tell you what I know, he said, and then you're going to tell me what you know. And then we're going to figure out what to do about what neither of us knows yet. He paused. That work for you? Yes, Nora said. He nodded. He began. The story Kyle Denton told was not a simple story. Grant listened from his corner and did not interrupt and did not look away and understood maybe 70% of what was being said. Because it involved operational specifics he didn't have the background to fully follow. But the shape of it was clear enough. Kyle had served. Army, not Navy. 2 tours in Afghanistan, 1 in Iraq. He had come back the way some men come back, with skills that the civilian world didn't have clean applications for and a particular relationship with authority that made standard employment a consistent problem. Iron Grave MC had seemed, at first, like the right container for what he had become. It was not. He had understood this gradually, and then suddenly, the way most important understandings arrive. The club had connections that went beyond what he had been told when he joined. Business arrangements that had been described to him in terms he had accepted because he was tired, and the terms were vague enough to be acceptable if you didn't look directly at them. He had stopped not looking directly at them in late 2021. By 2022, he understood the specifics. Iron Grave was moving weapons, not drugs, not the other things clubs like this typically moved. Weapons. Military-grade hardware that had been acquired through channels that were not legal and was being transported through the Northern Corridor to buyers that Kyle had never been given names for and had not asked for names because he had already started to understand that not knowing was itself a form of participation. He had been trying to find a way out that didn't end with him in the ground when October 2022 happened. I didn't know about the operation, he said. I want to be clear about that. I did not know there was a joint operation in the Gulf of Aden. I did not know that any military personnel were going to be anywhere near the route that shipment was taking. Nora was very still. What I knew, Kyle said, was that there was a shipment and that something went wrong with it. And that 2 men from outside the organization showed up in the aftermath and started asking the kind of questions that meant they had information they shouldn't have had. He looked at Nora. I found out later what went wrong. Someone in the U.S. military had been monitoring the route, had been building a case, had gotten close enough that the people who arranged these shipments decided they needed the monitoring to stop. He stopped. They contracted it out, he said, to 3 men who had done work like that before. Men who knew how to make a military casualty look like a mission complication rather than a hit. The room was quiet. Grant watched Nora's face. She was doing something remarkable with it, holding it in a stillness that he was beginning to understand cost her more than it looked like it cost her. The stillness was not absence of feeling. It was feeling managed with extraordinary precision, the way you manage a controlled burn. You don't put the fire out. You give it a boundary and you hold the boundary. The men who were contracted, she said. Her voice was level. Do you have names? 1 name, Kyle said. The man who coordinated it. The man inside the system who identified the target and arranged the contract and made sure the after-action report said the right things. He looked at hers steadily. His name is Douglas Merritt. He's ATF. Has been for 20 years. Grant's coffee cup was empty. He did not get up to refill it. He did not move at all. He sat in his corner and held the empty up and watched Nora absorb what she had just been told. She was quiet for 10 full seconds. ATF, she said. Yes, not Navy. Not connected to the military chain of command. No. The weapons Iron Grave was moving had come from ATF evidence lockups originally. At least some of them. Merritt had been skimming and selling for years. The operation that your team was running had gotten close enough to the supply chain that Merritt decided the operator leading it needed to be removed. Kyle paused. He had access to operational details because he had cultivated sources inside the Joint Task Force structure. People who owed him things. He knew who was in the water that night. He knew the route. He knew the timing. Nora looked at her hands. He gave all of that to the men he contracted, Kyle said. And the report, Nora said, the after-action report with the errors. Merritt wrote it, or had it written. He had enough access and enough favors owed that he could place a document in the right system and have it accepted. He drank his coffee. He's been very careful for a very long time, and very useful to enough people that nobody has looked too hard. Until now, Nora said. Is that what this is? Kyle said. That's what I intend it to be. Kyle looked at her for a moment. "What do you have?" he said. "Enough to establish the pattern. Not enough to prove the specific action on the night." She paused. "I need a witness. Someone who can put merit in the coordination of that specific contract. That's a difficult thing to find." "I know." Kyle was quiet. He turned his coffee cup in a slow circle. "There's a man," he said, carefully. "One of the three who were contracted that night. He's not in the country anymore. Hasn't been for 2 years. But he left something behind. Documentation. The kind a man keeps as insurance when he works for someone he doesn't entirely trust." He looked up at her. "I've known where it is for 18 months. Nora looked at him. "Why haven't you used it?" "Because using it means a conversation I wasn't ready to have," he said. "About what I was part of. About what I allowed to happen because I was looking for the exit and moving too slowly." He held her gaze. "I'm having that conversation now, with you, and it's not comfortable." "No," Nora said, "it isn't. But here we are, she said. Grant listened to all of this and felt the particular heaviness of a room full of truths being set on the table. The weight of things said aloud that had only been carried internally for a long time. It changed the air of a place, that kind of honesty. Made it thicker, made it harder to breathe, but also somehow more necessary to breathe. He thought about what Nora had told him in the afternoon, about Lila Corvin, 40 miles away, not knowing. He thought about his phone in his jacket pocket. He thought about a number he had not called in 2 years. The first flashback came to Nora the way they always came. Not invited, not in a moment of stillness or reflection. In the middle of something else, the way water comes through a wall, finding the weakest point. Kyle had paused to refill his coffee from the pot on the counter. Nora was looking at the table in front of her, and the diner around her was quiet, and the heater in the corner was humming. And for one unguarded moment, the hum was the hum of a motor, and the diner was the dark water of the Gulf of Aden, and she was 22 years old, and the night was complete around the boat. October, 11:40 at night. The insertion point's 40 minutes ahead. James Corvin was in the forward position of the SWCC's craft, flat against the hull, watching the water ahead with the kind of attention that looked like stillness but was its opposite. Active stillness. The stillness of someone processing everything their senses could reach. They had run this corridor 6 times before. This was the 7th. Nora had her hands on the throttle at 3/4 speed. The boat was low in the water and dark and fast, and she knew its responses the way she knew her own hands. Better sometimes. The boat did not have the complicated relationship with itself that hands had. Corvin turned and looked at her. Just once. Just for a moment. He had a way of doing that on approach, not checking the instruments or the water, checking her, making sure she was where she needed to be, not physically but otherwise. It was a thing he did, and she had never asked him about it, and he had never explained it, and it was one of the things she would think about afterward for a very long time. She had nodded. He had turned back to the water. 4 minutes later, everything had gone wrong in the way that things go wrong when they have been set up to go wrong. Not chaos, precision. The difference between a malfunction and a design. She had not seen the other boat until its lights came on. By then it was already close. Corvin had shouted one word, down. He had moved at the same time he shouted it, thrown his weight sideways, putting his body between her and the direction the fire was coming from. She had felt the impact of him against her, rather than the impact of anything else. And then she had been in the water, and the boat was above her and around her, and she was under it, and the world was noise and cold and dark. She had come up on the far side. She had not found him. She had called his name twice, which was 2 times more than protocol allowed. And then she had gotten back to doing her job, because her job was the only thing between her and the alternative. And she had always been good at her job. She had never stopped being angry at herself for getting back to her job. Kyle set the coffee pot down, and the sound of it brought her back. The diner, the heater, Grant in his corner. She looked at the table. 3 years of practice, and the return trip still took a moment. "You all right?" Kyle said. "Yes." He looked at her in a way that suggested he did not entirely believe her, but was going to respect the answer. "There's something else you need to know," he said, sitting back down. "About that night. About what happened after." Nora looked at him. Kyle's jaw set. He was doing his own version of the work she had just done, holding something in place while deciding how much of it to let move. "The man who was in the water with your operator," he said slowly. "The contractor. The one who went in after he went down." He stopped. "He told me something 18 months ago when I first started trying to understand what I was actually part of." Nora was very still. "He said that the operator was alive when he reached him. The clock on the wall ticked. Ticked. What? Nora said. One word, the flattest possible word for what it was carrying. He said the operator was alive, injured but alive and conscious. Kyle looked at his hands. He said he made a call in the water, that he didn't carry out the contract. Nora stared at him. Kyle looked up. I don't know what happened after that. I don't know if he's telling the truth. I don't know what condition your man was in, or what resources he had, or whether he could have survived regardless. I'm telling you what one man told me in a conversation I have turned over in my head every day since. Nora said nothing. She was doing the flattest, most complete kind of nothing Grant had ever seen a person do. Like every system had been redirected to the single task of processing what had just been said. You're telling me, she said finally. Her voice was precise in the way of someone choosing each word individually. You're telling me that the man who was contracted to kill James Corvin chose not to. That's what he told me. And you didn't know where Corvin was afterward? No, but he wasn't confirmed dead. Not by anyone I spoke to. Nora stood up. She walked behind the counter. She stood there with her back to the room for a long moment, her hands on the counter, not gripping it this time, just resting there. Grant watched her. He thought about the phone in his pocket. He thought about the number. He thought about a conversation from 2 years ago. A man who had called him from a number he didn't recognize, who had spoken in a voice that was as careful and damaged and very, very tired, and who had said things that Grant had kept as carefully as anything he had ever kept, held carefully in the place where he kept the things that mattered most, the things too important to name. He put his hand in his jacket pocket. The door opened. Not Kyle's men, not who Grant expected. A woman stepped in from the cold, 30, maybe a year or two either side. Dark red hair pulled back. She was wearing the dark blue scrubs of someone coming off a long shift and a coat pulled hastily over them. Her face had the particular tiredness of medical work, the kind that settles into the skin rather than just the eyes. She stopped when she saw Kyle. Then she saw Nora behind the counter. She said uncertainly, I heard there was some kind of trouble this morning. I was driving past and I saw the light on. Patty had left 2 lights on inside. A habit. She always left 2 on after close. Nora looked at the woman looked at Nora, and Grant, watching from his corner, saw Nora's fist do something it had not done once in the hours he had been watching it. Go completely unguarded. When a friend once sex, something raw and large moved across Nora's face. Not grief exactly. Something more specific than grief. Recognition tangled up with something that had no clean name. Can I help you? Nora said. Her voice was almost steady. I'm sorry to bother you, the woman said. I'm a nurse. I work at the clinic in Whitefish. I heard the thing this morning with the bikers, and I was driving back from a shift, and I saw the light, and I don't know why I stopped. She gave an uncertain laugh. I think I just wanted to make sure everybody was all right. Whitefish. Grant watched Nora very carefully. What's your name? Nora said. Leela, the woman said. Leela Corvin. The silence that followed was short, maybe 3 seconds. But Grant had lived through silences that seemed short and contained years, and this was one of those. He watched Nora absorb the name. He watched her face move through something. He watched her make a decision she had been avoiding for 3 years and then unmake it and then make it again in the space of a breath. Come in, Nora said. Please, sit down. I'll get you some coffee. Corvin came in and sat at the table nearest the door, instinctively leaving herself the shortest path back to the outside. The way people do when they have walked into a room they're not sure about. She looked at Kyle with polite wariness. Kyle looked at her and said nothing. Nora brought coffee. She set it down in front of Lila and sat across from her and put her hands flat on the table and said, I need to tell you something, and I need you to understand before I say it that I have been trying to find the right way to say it for a long time. Lila looked at her. Okay, she said. Careful. The caution of a person who has learned that preface statements rarely lead somewhere comfortable. My name is Nora Callahan. I was a combatant craft crewman in the U.S. Navy from 2019 to 2022. Lila was still. I served on a joint operation with a SEAL team in October 2022. In the Gulf of Aden. Nora stopped. I served alongside your brother. The room was very quiet. Lila Corvin looked at Nora Callahan for a long time. They told us, she said finally. Her voice was not loud. They told us it was a training accident, stateside. That's what the letter said. I know. That's what we buried. I know that too. Lila looked down at her coffee cup. Her hands were around it, and Grant could see that they were not steady. You were there, Lila said. Yes, as you were there that night, yes. Lila looked up. Her eyes were the same dark color as the hair. They were wet but not spilling over. The eyes of someone who has had practice holding things in place. Tell me, she said. Whatever you know, tell me. Nora told her. Not everything. Not full weight of 3 years and everything Kyle had said and everything Grant suspected. She told her the shape of it, the outline in clear, honest lines. James Corvin had been running a real operation in a real location. He had been doing his job, the job he was trained for, the job he believed in. He had not died in a training accident. He had been in harm's way because he was doing something that mattered, and someone had decided that what he was doing mattered too much to the wrong people. She told Lila that she did not know with certainty what had happened to him in the water. She told her that she had reason to believe the situation might be more complicated than what the official record said. She stopped it there. Lila was quiet for a long time. More complicated, she said. Yes. What does more complicated mean? Nora looked at her directly. It means, she said, that I am not willing to tell you he is gone until I am certain, and I am not yet certain. Lila looked at her, then at Kyle, who had been silent throughout, then at Grant in his corner, whom she seemed to notice for the first time. Who are you? She said to Grant. Grant Elwood. I'm nobody in particular. I just drink coffee here and pay attention. Lila looked at him for a moment. That's James, she said. That's exactly something James would have done. Grant didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. Lila looked back at Nora. 3 years, she said. Yes, you've been looking for 3 years. Yes. Lila was quiet. Something moved through her face, complex and layered, the way grief moves when something new is added to it, not replacing what was there, but rearranging it, changing the shape of something that had hardened into a shape she knew. Why didn't you come to me sooner? She said. Because I didn't have answers, Nora said. I only had questions. And I didn't want to put that on you without having something to give you alongside it. Lila looked at her. I'm a nurse, she said quietly. I've sat with people while they waited for answers that might not come. I've held people's hands through the not knowing. She paused. The not knowing is not the worst thing. The worst thing is not knowing and also being alone in it. Nora looked at her hands. I know, she said. I understand that now. Grant thought about what he'd said to Nora that afternoon, about carrying things alone, about decisions that felt protective but were also, underneath the protection, a form of distance. Nora had understood it then. He could tell she had understood it. He could tell it had landed. But there is a difference between understanding something and being ready for what it asks of you. He thought she was ready now. At 8:47, Grant's phone buzzed. He took it out of his pocket, looked at the key. Not a call, a text from a number saved under a name that was not a name but 2 initials and a year that he had assigned it himself. JC 2022. The message was 4 words. Is she still there? Grant looked at it. He looked at the room. Nora and Lila at their table. Kyle with his coffee, watching the room the way men like Kyle watched rooms, the low light and the empty chairs and the clock above the counter at 8:47 on a December evening in Cutters Creek, Montana. He thought about the call from 2 years ago. A voice careful and damaged and very tired. Grant had kept it. He had kept it for 2 years and told no one. The call had come the way unexpected things came, without warning, without context. The man said, I got your number from a contact at Coronado, someone who runs support logistics there. She said you donated to the Naval Special Warfare Foundation 3 years straight after your nephew's selection attempt. She said that kind of loyalty to something you were never part of meant you were the right kind of person to trust. Grant had thought about that for a long time afterward. He had not verified it. He had not tried to. Some things you either believed or you didn't, and the believing or not believing said more about you than about the thing. He had believed it. He had kept it. The trouble came at 9:22. Grant heard it first, the specific sound of more than one vehicle approaching, not motorcycles this time, the heavier, more official sound of large American-made trucks. He looked at the window. 2 sets of headlights, coming from the east end of Main Street. They pulled up in front of the Rusty Nail and stopped, and the headlights stayed on, illuminating the window of the diner from outside. And the doors opened and closed. Kyle had heard it too. He was already on his feet. He looked at the window with a specific expression. Not surprise, the expression of someone whose timeline has been moved up without their permission. That's Leland, he said. He said it to Nora, not as information, as a warning. Nora stood. She looked at Lila. I need you to go to the back, she said. Through the kitchen, there's a door to the alley. Wait there. What's happening? I'm not sure yet, please. Lila looked at her. Then she stood and did as she was told. The kitchen door swung closed behind her. Nora looked at Kyle. You called him, she said. It was not an accusation. It was a question that already knew its answer. No, Kyle said. I didn't. Then who? Kyle's jaw was tight. Someone who's been watching longer than you knew, he said. Someone who knew you were here before you sat down in this 6 months ago. Sheriff Bart Leland came through the door of the Rusty Nail at 9:23. He was not alone. 2 deputies flanked him, both of them younger than Grant's youngest son. Both of them with the particular blankness of men following instructions they understood not to question. Leland was 54 years old, heavy-set but not soft. The heaviness of a man who had once been large with muscle and had retained the frame while the muscle converted to something else. He had a face that had been reasonably honest once and had learned to not be. Grant had known that face for 15 years. He had watched it learn. Leland looked at the room, at Kyle, at Grant, at Nora. He did not look surprised by any arrangement of the room. He had already known who was where. "Evening, Nora," he said. "Sheriff," she said. "You've had quite a day. Some days are like that." Leland moved to the center of the room. He moved with the comfort of a man who has decided the space is his. He had always had that quality. Grant had attributed it at once to the confidence of authority. He understood it differently now. "I'm going to need you to come with me," Leland said to Nora, "just to answer some questions. Routine follow-up on this morning's incident." "It's almost 9:30 at night," Nora said. "Timing's unfortunate. These things come up when they come up." Nora looked at him steadily. "Am I being arrested?" "No, just asked to assist with an inquiry. Then I'm not required to come." Leland smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a man who has anticipated this response and is not inconvenienced by it. "Nora," he said, "let's not do this the complicated way. It's cold and it's late, and we all want to get home." Kyle took one step forward. One of the deputies moved a hand. Kyle stopped. He looked at Leland. "Dale," he said, "think about what you're doing." "I'm doing my job, Kyle. You're doing somebody else's job." Leland's expression didn't change. He looked back at Nora. "Let's go," he said. Nora looked at Grant. It was the same look she gave to home after the collar was torn that morning. An exchange of information in the space between 2 people, quick and complete. Grant gave her the smallest nod he could manage. Something she saw in it, or something she decided in the moment she looked for it, settled her face. She looked back at Leland. "All right," she said. She came out from behind the counter. She let one of the deputies take her arm, which she did not resist, and which she was clearly choosing not to resist rather than incapable of resisting, and which she wanted Grant to know she was choosing. He knew. At the door, she looked back once. Not at Kyle, not at the room, at Grant. And then she was outside and the door was closed and the headlights outside swept across the window and the sound of the trucks moved down Main Street and was gone. Kyle stood in the middle of the room. He looked at Grant. "You need to tell me," Kyle said, "if there's anything that can help her that you haven't said yet." Grant looked at him. He looked at the kitchen door where James Corvin was waiting in the alley. He looked at his phone. He thought about a voice from 2 years ago. He thought about a man who had chosen to keep his existence private for 3 years, who had trusted Grant with the knowledge of that existence and had asked nothing in return except to be kept, preserved. The knowledge of him kept safe until the moment it needed to be used. Grant thought that the moment might have arrived. He took out his phone. He looked at Kyle. "There might be something," he said, "but I need to make a call first." Kyle said nothing. He sat back down. He picked up his coffee. Grant got up from his corner table. He walked to the window. He stood looking out at the empty street. He found the number. He pressed call. 1 ring, 2, 3. The voice that answered was quieter than it had been 2 years ago, more careful. The voice of a man who had been holding himself very still for a long time and had gotten good at it. "Grant," the voice said. "She's here," Grant said. "She's been here and she's in trouble, and I think it's time." A long pause. The heat hummed in the corner. The clock above the counter read 9:31. "Lila," the voice said. "She's here too. She came tonight. She doesn't know yet." Another pause, longer. Grant waited. Kyle sat at his table and drank his cold coffee and said nothing. And the room held everything it was holding. Then the voice said, "I'll come. How long? I'm not far." Grant closed his eyes briefly. "James," he said. "Yeah." "You should know she's been looking for 3 years. A silence. The particular silence of a person receiving something they have been trying not to hope for." "I know," James Corvin said. "I know she has." Grant opened his eyes. Outside the window, Cutter's Creek was dark and cold and still. Inside the Rusty Nail, something that had been gone for 3 years was in the process of becoming possible again. Grant put his phone in his pocket. He turned back to the room. Kyle Denton was looking at him with an expression that was the closest thing to bewilderment Grant had ever seen on that particular face. "Who did you just call?" Kyle said. Grant walked back to his corner table. He sat down. He picked up his empty coffee cup. Someone who should have been in this conversation from the beginning, he said. He set the cup down. He settled back in his chair. We're going to need to get Nora back first, he said. Kyle looked at him for a long moment. Then something shifted in his face. Something that had been set against moving, something that had been holding one shape for a long time and was now quietly in the darkness of a diner in Montana, beginning to decide on a different one. Yeah, Kyle said. He stood up. Yeah, we are. The warehouse was on the east edge of town. Abandoned grain storage. 3 stories of corrugated steel that had been standing since the 70s and had been empty since the 90s when the co-op that owned it moved its operation 40 miles south. The town had talked about demolishing it every few years and never gotten around to it. Grant knew the building. He had known it for 20 years the way you know structures that have been background your whole life, present but unconsidered. Of the landscape rather than part of the story. Tonight it was part of the story. Kyle had found out through a call of his own, made quietly while Grant was putting on his coat. One of his men had seen Leland's trucks turn east on Callaway Road rather than north toward the county sheriff's office. East on Callaway Road dead-ended at 2 places, the grain storage facility and a cattle operation that belonged to Ed Purcell's brother-in-law. Leland wasn't going to Ed Purcell's brother-in-law's cattle operation. Kyle drove. Grant sat in the passenger seat of a truck that had belonged to one of Kyle's men and that Kyle had not asked permission to borrow. The heater worked, but it took time, and the cab was cold, and Grant sat with his hands in his jacket pockets and watched the dark edge of town move past the window. Lila Corvin was in the back seat. She had refused to stay in the alley. Kyle had suggested firmly that she remain at the Rusty Nail. Lila had looked at him. Nurses look at patients who are suggesting things contrary to their own welfare. The woman in that building, Lila had said, went to that building because she has spent 3 years trying to find out what happened to my brother. I am not waiting in an alley. Kyle had looked at Grant. Grant had shrugged. Lila was in the back seat. The warehouse sat back from Callaway Road, behind a gravel lot that had weeds growing through the cracks in the pavement. 2 trucks were parked in front of the main entrance. Leland's official vehicle and a second one, unmarked dark blue. The kind of vehicle that belonged to someone who wanted to look like they weren't official while being official. Kyle pulled off the road 200 yards short of the lot and cut the engine. The 3 of them sat in the dark. 2 vehicles, Kyle said. Leland and at least 1 other, Grant said. The other vehicle isn't county. No federal, Kyle said. It was not a question. Grant thought about what Kyle had told them in the diner, about Douglas Merritt. ATF. 20 years of careful maneuvering and careful placement and careful accumulation of people who owed him things and careful removal of people who threatened to cost him things. Probably, Grant said. Kyle looked at the building. She's been in there 40 minutes, he said. I know, we don't know the layout. I've been in there once, Grant said. 15 years ago, there was a community meeting about the demolition proposal. Main floor is open, big. There's a loading area on the south side and an office space on the north that was built into the corner. 2 stories, steel stairs. Kyle absorbed that. If they wanted privacy, he said, they'd use the office. North corner, Grant said. Kyle nodded. He looked at Lila in the rearview mirror. You stay with the truck, he said. I'll stay with the truck, Lila said. The agreement came easily enough that Grant suspected she had already decided what she would actually do and was simply managing the current conversation. He and Kyle got out. The cold hit immediately. December in Montana at 10 o'clock at night was a specific and serious cold. The coffin that found the gap at your collar and the space between your glove and your sleeve and reminded you that the landscape here had been indifferent to human presence for a very long time and intended to remain so. They moved across the gravel lot without speaking. The side door was unlocked. This struck Grant as either careless or deliberate. And he had been alive long enough to know that when something in a bad situation seemed careless, it was usually deliberate. He mentioned this to Kyle in a murmur as they moved inside. Kyle nodded. He was already looking at the room the way someone trained for enclosed spaces looked at rooms, not the way Grant had looked at mine shafts. A different training, a different set of things to account for. But the underlying principle was the same. You read the space before the space read you. The main floor of the warehouse was dark except for a line of light coming from the north corner office. Yellow light through a gap in the interior wall. Not bright. The light of a single overhead fixture. They heard voices before they could make out words. 2 voices. One was Leland. Grant knew that voice from 15 years of county commission meetings and 4th of July remarks in the particular cadence of a man who had learned to say things without committing to them. The second voice was one Grant had not heard before. Flat, unhurried. The voice of a man who was accustomed to controlling rooms he walked into, not through volume but through the simple assumption that control was his to have. They moved along the wall. The warehouse floor was concrete, cold through Grant's boots. Somewhere above them, a bird had gotten into the rafters and moved once and went still. The office had a window looking out onto the main floor. Interior window, the kind built for a foreman to observe the loading operation without going out into the weather. The blinds were down, but not fully closed.
Kyle will first.
He looked through the gap in the blinds. Then he stepped back and let Grant look. The office was maybe 30 feet square. Metal desk, 2 filing cabinets that hadn't been used in decades, folding chairs arranged without intention. Leland stood near the door with his arms crossed, not the posture of a man in charge of the room. Nora sat in a folding chair in the center of the space. Her hands were not cuffed. She was sitting the way she sat in everything, with the particular quality of stillness that Grant had been observing for 6 months and had only recently understood. Not passive stillness, active containment. She was watching the man standing in front of her. Douglas Merritt, 49, maybe 50, medium height. The kind of build that was unremarkable by design. The body of a man who had learned that being forgettable was professionally useful. Gray at the temples, a face that had a quality of surfaces, smooth in a way that read as pleasant, until you noticed that pleasant was all it was doing. He was standing in front of Nora with his hands in his pockets, relaxed in the way that was itself a kind of pressure. Nora, he was saying, I want you to understand that this doesn't have to be complicated. You've said that twice, Nora said. It doesn't get simpler the more you say it. You've been building a case for 3 years. I understand that. I respect the dedication, genuinely. But what you've built is built on a premise that's correct, and everything downstream of an incorrect premise is incorrect regardless how carefully it's constructed. Which premise? Shh. That James Corvin was targeted. He was targeted. Merritt tilted his head slightly. Patient. The patience of a man who has had this kind of conversation before and knows how it ends. James Corvin was in a high-risk operational theater, Merritt said. Friendly fire incidents happen. Equipment failures happen. The after-action report reflects a thorough investigation of a tragic outcome. The after-action report has 3 factual errors, first 2 paragraphs. Merritt smiled. Clerical errors, he said, in a document produced under time pressure following a traumatic incident. The GPS coordinates listed for the insertion point are 40 nautical miles from where we actually were. Typo. The designation of the supporting vessel is wrong. Human error. The date of the operation is wrong. Merritt's smile stayed exactly where it was. I appreciate the attention to detail, he said. It's one of the things that made Corvin effective. And clearly it's something he valued in his crew. He paused. But Nora, you were 22 years old and in the water at night in a combat situation. Memory under those conditions is not reliable. The report reflects the official record. Your recollection reflects trauma. Grant watched Nora's face through the gap in the blinds. She looked at Merritt. She looked at him the way she had looked at everything all day. Reading it, accounting for it, filing it. She said, I want to ask you something. Of course. When you wrote that report, she said, did you think about the family? The people who were going to receive it and accept it as the truth of what happened to someone they loved? Merritt's expression moved slightly. I didn't write the report, he said. Did the person who wrote it think about that? Nora, his sister, Nora said. She's 30 years old. She believed for 3 years that her brother died in a training accident. She arranged her grief around that. She built a story about it that she could live inside. And the foundation of that story was a document that someone wrote in order to protect themselves. Merritt looked at her. That's a very emotional framing, he said. Yes, Nora said. It is because it's about people, actual people. That's what you keep leaving out of your version, the actual people. Merritt was quiet for a moment. Then he sighed. A performance of patience exhausted. I'm going to need the documentation, he said. Whatever you've compiled over the past 3 years. Digital copies, physical copies, drives, cloud storage, all of it. And if I don't have anything, then we have a conversation about why you've been in surveillance on a federal officer's operational activities for 18 months, which is its own kind of problem. I wasn't surveilling a federal officer, Nora said. I was tracking an organized criminal network that happened to intersect with a federal officer. Merritt looked at her for a long moment. The pleasantness on his face thinned. Not gone, but thinner, the way ice thins in early spring, still holding but differently. "Nora," he said, "this ends tonight, one way or another. The only variable is what tonight cost you." He reached into his jacket pocket, not for the phone, not yet. He set something on the desk between them. A photograph. Nora looked at it. It was a photograph of Patty Oswald's house, taken from the street. Through the front window, you could see the kitchen light on. "Mrs. Oswald has a very nice home," Merritt said. "I understand she's lived there 40 years. Alone, since her husband passed." He left the photograph on the desk. "I mention this only so you understand the full scope of what tonight means. Not just for you." Nora looked at the photograph. Then she looked at Merritt. "Now I understand," she said, "exactly who you are." The office door opened inward. Kyle went through it the way Grant imagined he went through most doors in situations like this. Without announcement, without pausing at the threshold to assess. The assessment happened while he was already moving. Leland reached for his hip. Kyle said, "Don't," one word. The specific weight of a word said by a specific kind of person in a specific kind of voice. Leland's hands stopped. Merritt turned. He looked at Kyle. He looked at Grant. He looked at both of them with the evaluating calm of a man deciding what category they fit into. "Mr. Denton," he said, not surprised, not unsurprised, neutral, in the way of someone for whom surprise was a resource not to be wasted. "Merritt," Kyle said, "you're interfering with a federal investigation." "You're not conducting a federal investigation," Kyle said. "You're conducting a personal risk management exercise." Merritt looked at Grant. "And you are?" "Nobody," Grant said. "I drink coffee at that diner and pay attention." Merritt looked at him for a moment longer. Then he looked at Nora. "You called them," he said. "I didn't call anyone," Nora said. She stood up from the folding chair. "They came because that's what people do when someone they know is in trouble." She paused. "You might not have much personal experience with that." Merritt's jaw tightened, just slightly. The pleasantness on his face made one more adjustment, thinner still. "This doesn't change the situation," he said. "You have documentation or you don't. If you do, you hand it over. If you don't, we've all wasted a very unpleasant evening." "I don't have it with me," Nora said. "Where is it?" "Somewhere safe." "That's not an answer." "No," Nora said, "it isn't." Merritt looked at Leland. Leland took a step toward Nora. Kyle moved at the same time. He was between Leland and Nora before the step completed. He was a large man moving with the speed of a man who had trained the gap between intention and action to almost nothing. Leland stopped. "Dale," Kyle said. Leland looked at him. "You know what you're part of," Kyle said. "You've known for a while. You've been telling yourself the story that makes it acceptable. The one where you're practical rather than corrupt, where it's management rather than complicity." He held Leland's eyes. "Stop telling yourself that story. It's too late for it now anyway." Leland's face moved. Something worked it through it. Not remorse exactly. More like the specific exhaustion of a man who has been maintaining a position for a long time and is running out of the energy it takes. "Kyle," Leland said, "stay out of this." "No," Kyle said simply. Merritt had been still through all of this, watching, recalibrating the smooth surface of his face doing its work. "All right," he said. He said it quietly. The tone of a man transitioning from one approach to another. He reached into his jacket. Grant saw Kyle shift his weight. Merritt produced a phone. He held it up so they could see that it was a phone. He looked at Nora. "I'm going to make a call," he said. "And the people I'm calling are going to be here inside of 20 minutes. And when they arrive, the calculus of this situation changes in ways that aren't in your favor." He held the phone. "This is your last window to make a different decision. Make your call." Nora said. Merritt looked at her. "You're 25 years old," he said. "You have a life that hasn't happened yet, a career. Everything that comes after this, whatever this is, think about that." "I think about James Corvin," Nora said. "I've been thinking about James Corvin for 3 years. I think I can manage thinking about my own career." Merritt looked at her for a long moment. Then he dialed. What happened next did not happen in the order anyone in the room expected. Merritt had the phone to his ear. The call connected. And from outside the warehouse, from the direction of Callaway Road, came the sound of vehicles. Multiple vehicles. Not the sound of the trucks that had brought Leland here. Different, more of them, and something else mixed in. The particular low frequency of a cover somewhere above the ceiling of cloud. Merritt lowered his phone. He listened. His face, for the first time, did something genuine. It went uncertain. Grant looked at Kyle. Kyle was looking at the ceiling of the office. tracking the sound above it. His head was slightly tilted, the way someone tilts their head when they are using in context they would prefer not to remember. That's not local, Kyle said. No, Grant said. Merritt looked at his phone, then at the door, then at Nora. What did you do? He said. It was the first time he had asked rather than stated. Nora looked at him. I didn't do anything, he said. Tonight? This evening. She paused. Last 3 years are a different answer. The door to the warehouse opened. Not the side door that Grant and Kyle had come through. The main loading door, the large one. It rolled on its track with the groan of metal that had not moved in a long time, and the cold air came through first and then the light. 3 people came through the door. Grant recognized with 2 of them Lila Corvin, who had not stayed with the truck, and behind her, a man. Tall, thinner than he should have been. A beard that had grown because there had been a period when shaving was not the priority. He walked with a slight drag in his left leg that he had clearly learned to compensate for but had not fully eliminated. His hair was longer than it had been in whatever photographs Nora had carried in her memory. But his face was his face. Grant had only seen it twice, once on a phone screen or a call he had not expected and could not fully prepare for. Once in a photograph that Nora had not shown him but that he had understood from context was somewhere in her possession. James Corvin walked into the warehouse. He looked at the room. He looked at Kyle, at Merritt, at Leland, and then he looked at Nora. Nora stood in the middle of the office with her hands at her sides. She looked at him. She looked at him the way you look at something that you have been telling yourself for 3 years was gone, that you have built a relationship with its absence, that you have organized your life around the fact of its not being there, and then it is there, and everything that has been organized has to reorganize. She did not move toward him immediately. She stood very still, and something happened to her face that Grant had not seen it do once in the entire day, not once in 6 months of morning coffees and careful observation. It broke open, not into grief, not into relief exactly, into something that had those things in it and something else that was bigger than both of them combined, something that had no name he could reach. You're supposed to be dead, she said. Her voice was completely steady. James Corvin looked at her. I know, he said. I'm sorry. The third person who had come through the warehouse door was a woman Grant did not recognize. 50, maybe. Short gray hair, a jacket that was not a fashion choice. She carried herself with the specific quality of someone whose authority was institutional rather than performed. She did not need to fill a room. She was simply in it, and the room adjusted. She had a badge. She held it up briefly and efficiently. Inspector General's Office, Department of Defense, she said. Special Investigations Division. She looked at Merritt. Merritt looked at her. His face went through something that Grant thought might be the most honest thing it had done all evening. Agent Merritt, she said. We've been building a case for 14 months. We've had 3 cooperating witnesses. As of 48 hours ago, we received the final documentation necessary to proceed. She paused. I'd like to advise you of your rights. Merritt looked at Nora. He looked at her with something that had moved through whatever performance he had been maintaining and come out the other side. The documentation, he said. You had it. I've had it for 14 months, Nora said. I've been helping the IG's office build the chain of evidence necessary to use it. Merritt absorbed that. This whole time, he said. Not the whole time, Nora said. The first 18 months I was just looking, building the picture, trying to understand what happened. She held his gaze. When I understood enough to know I couldn't prosecute it alone, I found people who could, and then I waited while they did the rest of it correctly. Grant looked at Nora. She had not told him this. She had told him she was following Kyle's route, that she had been tracking Iron Grave for 18 months, that she had documentation and needed a witness. She had not told him about the IG's office. He thought about it for a moment. Then he understood it. She had not told him because the protection of what she knew extended to what he knew. The fewer people who understood the full shape of the operation, the safer the operation was. She had told him what he needed to know to be useful. Nothing more. It was the most professional thing he had ever seen done in a diner. Leland was being spoken to quietly by one of the people who had come in behind the IG investigator. A deputy Grant did not recognize. Not county, not local, federal. Leland was not resisting. He had the look of a man who has been carrying something heavy for too long and has been waiting, without knowing it, for someone to tell him he could put it down. Kyle stood apart from all of it. He was watching Nora and James Corvin across the room. He was watching them with an expression that Grant was not going to try to name. It was the expression of a man confronting something complicated in himself. Not guilt exactly, not relief. Something in the territory between them that didn't have a clean address. Grant walked to him. The two of them stood side by side for a moment. "You knew he might be alive," Grant said. "Quiet, not accusing, just placing it." "I knew the contractor had said he was alive when he left him," Kyle said. "I didn't know what happened after. I chose to not find out because finding out meant doing something with what I found." He paused. "That was a choice I made. I'm going to have to live with the specifics of it." Grant said nothing. "I told her tonight," Kyle said. "I told her what the contractor said. I knew when I told her that I didn't know the outcome, that it might be worse to know the beginning and not the end." "It wasn't worse," Grant said. "No." Kyle looked at Nora and James Corvin across the room. "It wasn't." Lila Corvin had crossed the warehouse floor. She had crossed it at the pace of someone who is not running, because running is not the right thing, but who is moving at every speed available to them that is not running. She reached her brother. James Corvin put his arms around his sister. Grant looked away. Some things are not for witnesses, not even careful ones. He looked at steel walls of the old warehouse, the dark rafters above, the concrete floor that had held grain and machinery and the working life of a community for decades, and had then held nothing for 30 years, and was now holding this. He thought that places absorbed things, not mystically, just physically, the way wood absorbs smell, the way stone absorbs a temperature. Things happened in places, and the places held the shape of them even when the things themselves were gone. This warehouse was going to hold tonight for a long time. He thought that was probably all right. The IG investigator, whose name was Sandra Oakes, spoke to Nora for 20 minutes in the corner of the warehouse. Grant observed this from a distance. He could not hear what was being said. He could see the shape of it, the shape of a conversation between two people who have been on the same side of something for over a year and are now at the end of what that side of it required. He could see Nora's face in profile. She was tired. He had not fully registered how tired she was until the performance of not being tired was no longer necessary. It came through now in the set of her shoulders and the line of her jaw and the particular quality of her eyes, which were still and clear but heavy in a way they had not been this morning. 25 years old, 3 years. He did the arithmetic and then stopped doing it because it didn't help anything to do it. Kyle had been taken aside by 2 of Oakes's people. Grant gathered from the body language that Kyle's cooperation over the preceding months had been known to the IG's office and had been part of the picture they had built. His status was complicated in the way that cooperating witnesses in federal cases were complicated. Not clean, not resolved, but different from what it had been this morning. Kyle handled the conversation with the directness of someone who has decided to stop managing his position and simply inhabit it. Grant appreciated that. He didn't know if he liked Kyle Denton. He was not sure that liking was the appropriate category. But he respected what the man had done tonight with what he knew and what he had kept. The decision to come back to the diner alone. The decision to tell Nora what the contractor had said. Those had been real decisions, made in real time, against the grain of self-interest. In Grant's experience, real decisions made against the grain of self-interest were the ones that counted. The rest was just behavior. It was after midnight when they came out of the warehouse. The cold had deepened the way Montana cold deepened after midnight in December. The sky had partially cleared, and there were stars in the gaps between the clouds. The mountains to the west were invisible but present. Grant could feel them the way you feel large things in the dark, by the space they took up rather than anything visible. James Corvin came out with Lila on one side and Nora on the other. He was walking carefully, the drag in his left leg more visible in the cold, which did things to old injuries. He did not look like the image Grant had constructed from context and one poor-quality phone screen. He looked like a man who had gone somewhere very difficult and come back changed by it in the way that things change when they are broken and healed. Differently shaped. But present, solid. He stopped near Grant. He looked at him. "You kept it," he said. 2 years, Grant said. Corvin nodded. "I didn't know how long it would need to be. I didn't want to ask for more than what was necessary." "You asked for exactly what was necessary," Grant said. "No more." Corvin held out his hand. Grant shook it. It was a firm handshake. The handshake of a man who had decided to be present in the handshake rather than somewhere else. "My nephew," Grant said. "Marcus. He tried for SWCC selection. Didn't make it. He told me about the people who did like they were a different category." Corvin looked at him. He wasn't wrong, Grant said. But the category isn't what I thought it was. I thought it was toughness. It isn't just toughness. What is it? Corvin said. Grant thought about it. He thought about Nora in the diner all day. The stillness, the management, the way she had sat down across from him in the afternoon and said the truest thing she had said all day in the quietest voice. It's what you do with the hard thing, Grant said, when it's in front of you. A lot of people can do a hard thing when there's no other option. The category is the people who do the right hard thing when they could choose the easier one. Corvin looked at him for a moment. I should have found a way to reach her sooner, he said. Yes, Grant said, you should have. Corvin nodded. He accepted that without the modification people usually added to it, without the explanation that softened it. Grant respected that. You've got time to fix it, Grant said. I know. Corvin looked at Nora, who was standing a few feet away talking to Lila. I don't know how much she'll let me. She came here to find out what happened to you, Grant said. She spent 3 years working towards something she wasn't sure had a right answer. She did it because it mattered to her, because you mattered to her. He paused. She's going to let you. Corvin said nothing. He looked at Nora. Grant gave them the moment and walked away. He found a section of gravel lot where he could see both the warehouse door and the road. He stood there with his hands in his jacket pockets and breathed the cold air and let the night be what it was. Kyle Denton came to stand beside him after a while. They stood in the way of two people who don't know each other and are not going to pretend they do, but are not uncomfortable sharing space. What happens to you now? Grant said. That's a conversation for people with lawyers, Kyle said. Are you worried about it? Kyle thought about it honestly. Some, he said. Less than I thought I would be. Turns out carrying something you did wrong is heavier than the consequences of admitting it. He paused. The weight changes when you put it down. Grant thought about the mines, the way you learned not to carry more than you needed to carry. The way extra weight underground was not just inconvenient, but dangerous. Every experienced miner learned to shed what wasn't necessary. That's true, Grant said. In my experience, that's true. Kyle looked at him. You're a strange man to find in a diner at 6 in the morning, Kyle said. I've been finding myself there for 20 years, Grant said. It stops feeling strange. You knew something was off about her. I noticed things, Grant said. I didn't know what they meant until later. Most people wouldn't have noticed. Most people weren't paying attention. Kyle was quiet for a moment. She's going to be all right, he says. Not a question. Yes, Grant said. You're confident about that. I'm confident about the things I've had time to observe carefully, Grant said. I've been observing her for 6 months. That's one of the things I'm most confident about. Kyle nodded. He put his hands in his jacket pockets. He looked at the stars in the gaps between the clouds. He said nothing else for a while. Grant stood beside him and did the same. Sandra Oaks found Grant before she left. She was organized in her departure the way she had been organized in her arrival. Efficient, purposeful. The quality of someone for whom time was a working resource. Mr. Elwood, she said. Miss Oaks, Nora speaks highly of you. She's been polite, Grant said. I'm not sure what I did that warranted it. You stayed, Oaks said. She told you to stay and not call anyone, and you stayed and you didn't call anyone. She paused. In a situation like this, that's not a small thing. Most people can't do that. They need to act. They need to insert themselves. They disrupt things. I'm 67 years old, Grant said. I've had time to learn the difference between acting and acting usefully. Oaks looked at him. The 2-year-old contact, she said. Corvin! Yes, you kept that completely private. He asked me to. He asked a stranger to hold knowledge that was significant and personal and potentially valuable, and to hold it without using it. Yes, and you did, yes. Oaks was quiet for a moment. Why? She said. Grant thought about it. Because he asked correctly, Grant said. He didn't tell me what to do with it. He didn't give me conditions or instructions. He told me he was alive and that someone would eventually need to know and that he trusted me to know when. He paused. People who ask correctly deserve to be answered correctly. Oaks looked at him for a long moment. That's a diminishing philosophy, she said. I know, Grant said. I keep it anyway. She nodded once, held out her hand. He shook it. She walked back to her vehicle. They drove back to the Rusty Nail at 1 in the morning. Kyle drove, Grant in the passenger seat. In the back, Nora and James Corvin sat with the particular careful distance of two people who have things to say and are choosing the right time for them. Lila sat between them. She had her brother's hand in hers, and she was not letting go of it, and nobody was going to suggest she should. Now the town was dark and still, Main Street asleep, the storefronts closed, the rusty nail with its 2 lights sapka burning the way Patty always left it. Kyle pulled up in front. They sat for a moment. "I'm not coming in," Kyle said. "I know," Nora said. He looked at her in the rearview mirror. "For what's wits worth," he said. "If I had known, at any point, what I was actually part of, I know," Nora said. I'm not sure you do. "I've been watching you all day," she said. "I know." Kyle held her gaze in the mirror for a moment. Then he nodded. Nora, James, and Lila got out of the truck. Grant started to follow. Kyle said Elwood. Grant looked at him. "Thank you," Kyle said. Grant considered various responses. He settled on drive carefully. He got out of the truck. The rusty nail was unlocked. Patty had left it that way. Grant did not know how she had known to do that. He supposed she had her own version of paying attention that he did not have full visibility into. The lights were low. The heater was on. The coffee machine had been prepped and needed only to be started. Grant started it. He found the chairs and brought them to the big table nearest the counter. Not the corner table, the center one. The one that could hold the most people. He thought that was the right table for tonight. Nora and James Corvin sat across from each other. Lila sat beside her brother. Grant brought coffee when it was ready. He set cups down and sat at the end of the table and wrapped his hands around his own cup and looked at the 3 of them. He was aware that this was not his story. He was a 67-year-old retired miner who had been in this diner when the story arrived and had stayed when asked to stay and had held what he was going to hold and had used it when the using was right. He was a witness. That was enough. James Corvin looked across the table at Nora. "I owe you an explanation," he said. "You owe me several," she said. "I know. Start wherever you want." Corvin looked at his coffee. "When I was in the water," he said, "after the boat, I wasn't dead. I knew I wasn't dead. I was hurt, but I knew I wasn't dead." He paused. "The man who came in the water after me. He had a choice and he made it, and I don't fully understand why he made it the way he did. But he pulled me to a position where I could be recovered rather than the alternative." "I know," Nora said. Kyle told me." Corvin nodded. "After recovery, I was in bad shape for a long time. Months. The people who found me were not connected to any official channel. They were not the kind of people whose involvement I could disclose." He stopped. "When I was well enough to think clearly about the situation, I understood that whoever had done this had access to the operation, had the ability to write the after-action report, had people in positions where disclosure on my part meant exposure of myself to the same threat." "You hid," Nora said. "Yes. For 3 years, yes. While I was looking for you, I knew you were looking." He held her gaze. "I left breadcrumbs where I could, things that would keep the investigation alive without exposing either of us to the risk of direct contact. I found Grant because I needed someone who was outside everything and who could hold a line of communication that wasn't traceable." He paused. "I didn't contact you directly because direct contact puts you in the same position I was in." Nora looked at him. "That was my choice to make," she said. "I know that now. You decided what risk I was allowed to take. Yes, that wasn't yours to decide." "No," he said. "It wasn't." The room held that. Grant drank his coffee. Lila had not released her brother's hand. She was watching Nora with the specific attention of someone who is understanding something about a person they have just met, something important, in real time. "She's right," Lila said to her brother. "Quiet. She's right, and you know she's right." Corvin looked at his sister. "I know," he said. "You've been protecting people your whole life," Lila said. "You protected me from knowing things about your work. You protected her from the risk of contact. You protected Grant from knowing more than he needed." She paused. "At some point, protection becomes a way of not trusting people with the truth." Corvin was quiet. Grant thought this was one of the most accurate things he had heard anyone say all day. He thought it was also something that extended beyond this table, beyond this story. Something true in the way that things were true when they applied to the most basic questions of how you lived with other people and what you owed them. What did you carry alone, and what did you carry together? Where the line was between protection and distance. How you knew the difference. "I learned someday," Nora said. She was looking at the table. Not at Corvin, at the grain of the pine wood, the same table she had served coffee from this morning before the world changed. "Someone told me this afternoon," she said, "that sometimes what feels like protecting people is also a way of staying separate from them. A way of deciding for them what they can bear." She looked up. "I've been doing that too. With Lila. With how much I told Grant. Even with Kyle tonight, I kept things back that I didn't need to." "You had operational reasons," Corvin said. "Some of them were operational," she said. And some of them were fear of being wrong, of bringing people into something that might hurt them, of needing people and having them not be there. She paused. I've been alone in this for 3 years. I told myself it was because it was safer for everyone else. And that was true. But it wasn't the only reason. Grant thought about his coffee. He thought about 20 years in his corner of this diner. He thought about 2 sons who called every couple of weeks and who he loved in the quiet, undemonstrative way of men who had not been shown other models and had tried to do better and had done better in some ways and not in others. He thought about how easy it was to mistake solitude for self-sufficiency. He had done that himself for years. The good news, he said, into the quiet of the room, is that 3 years isn't the rest of a life. They looked at him. You're both young, he said. You have most of it ahead. You can spend some of that time doing it differently. He looked at his coffee. That's not a small thing. That's a very large thing. Most people don't get the chance to understand at 25 what takes other people until 60 to figure out. Nora looked at him. What did it take you until 60 to figure out? She said. Grant thought about it honestly. That the people in the room with you, he said, are the story, not the thing you're working toward, not the resolution. The people in the room are already the thing. You spend your whole thinking the important part is what's coming, and you miss what's sitting across from you. He looked around the table. Nora and James Corvin and Lila and himself, the low light of a diner in a small Montana town at 1:30 in the morning, with coffee cooling in front of them, and outside the December dark and the mountains and the enormous indifferent beauty of the place. This is it, he said. This moment right here. This is the important part. The room was quiet. The heater hummed. The clock above the counter ticked toward 2 in the morning. Nora looked across the table at James Corvin. James Corvin looked back at her. After a long time, she reached across the table. She put her hand on his. She didn't say anything. He turned his hand and held hers. Lila looked at Grant. Grant looked at his coffee. He did not cry. He was 67 years old and had not cried in 30 years and was not going to start in a diner at 1:30 in the morning. But he felt the thing that preceded it. The pressure, the fullness, the sense of being present in a moment that had earned being present in. He was grateful for it. Grateful in the way you were grateful for things you hadn't known to ask for. He left at 2:15. He put on his coat. He picked up his jacket from the chair. He carried his cup to the counter and set it there. Nora stood up. She walked him to the door. They stood on the porch. The cold was absolute. The stars were fully out now, the clouds gone. And the sky above Cutter's Creek was the deep, clear black of a Montana winter night with nothing between you and the universe. Grant looked up at it. You're going to be all right, he said. I know, she said. Not because of anything you did or didn't do, he said. Just because you are. Some people have that quality. She looked at him. Thank you, she said, for staying. You asked me to stay. A lot of people don't when they're asked. Grant thought about that. My father, he said, worked a mine for 40 years. He used to say that the most important thing a man could do in a dangerous situation was stay present. Not brave, not strong, present. Just there. Just accounted for. He pulled his coat tighter. I've been trying to live up to that my whole life, some days better than others. Nora looked at him. You did today, she said. Grant nodded. He stepped off the porch. He walked to his truck. His boots crunched on the frozen gravel. The cold air went straight through him, and it was not entirely unpleasant. At 67, cold air in large quantities reminded you that you were alive, and that alive was not nothing. He drove home. The town was quiet around him. Dark houses and dark storefronts and the mountains invisible but present at the edge of everything. He parked in his driveway, sat for a moment. He thought about tomorrow morning, about walking into the Rusty Nail at 6:15. About Patty with the coffee pot and the corner table and the view of Main Street through the window that hadn't been cleaned in too long. He thought about whatever version of Nora Callahan would be there tomorrow. Still the same person, still 25, still precise and still and aware of exits, but different in the way that everything was different after the thing that was coming had arrived and been met. He got out of the truck. He stood in his driveway for a moment. The stars were very bright and very cold. And the mountains were out there in the dark, not going anywhere, which was one of the things he had always found comforting about mountains. They stayed. Whatever happened in the valley, whatever arrived and departed and changed and broke and rebuilt, the mountains stayed. He thought that was probably enough. He went inside.